So what we're going to look at now is discretionary fiscal policy, some of the problems associated with discretionary fiscal policy. So to start off with, definition, what is discretionary fiscal policy? And it's basically any attempt to use government expenditure or tax rates in order to change aggregate demand to work in a counter-cyclical way. So the government purposely changes tax rates and government expenditure to avoid a recession or to reduce the extent of a boom. So if a recession's coming along, what you do is you reduce tax rates and increase government expenditure. A little example: in 2008, the then Labour government, Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, reduced the VAT rate by 2.5%, from 17.5% to 15%, which probably injected around about 10 billion into the economy to try and pump prime the economy for a positive multiplier effect, actually, to reduce the severity of the recession. They also did a few other measures which were discretionary fiscal policy, but the main effect generally is non-discretionary fiscal policy, and this is when the government makes no deliberate attempt to change government expenditure or taxation. Automatic stabilisers just automatically indeed take their course, take their effect. Look at the video on that if you want to go over automatic stabilisers. So let's look at the problems. If you have a discretionary fiscal policy, and we're going to try and avoid a big recession coming, then the first problem may occur is a bit of a time lag. Because by the time you change fiscal policy, you need a budget, you need to get through your legislature. That takes time. Also, secondly, because you're going to change government expenditure, so you give departments more cash, say, it takes them time to spend it. They might have to get planning permission if the project's not, as we say, shovel ready, in order to build, say, a new hospital or a new school or some social housing. So this is all going to take time. So there's going to be a time lag, by which point you might be recovering from the recession, and it could indeed make the next boom worse. So there's a real problem with time lags with fiscal policy. And indeed the multiplier effect is uncertain and could be weak. So the UK economy, it's probably about, most rich countries, probably about 1.75% is the multiplier effect. But the fiscal multiplier, it's hard to work out exactly what the effect's going to be. And of course, if it's too big, then you could end up with a boom. If it's too little, you could end up with a recession. So it's what we call the problems of fine-tuning the economy, of keeping the economy exactly, not too cold, not too hot, exactly sort of somewhere near the trend rate of growth. Anyhow, the next problem is fiscal policy tends to be unflexible. So you can't change it in little discrete amounts like you can with monetary policy. Every month you could do it more frequently if you want. You can change interest rates by tiny amounts like 0.25%. See what happens, and then adjust them a bit further. Well, we can't do that with fiscal policy. And then the other problem is contractionary fiscal policy, that's deflationary fiscal policy, is often politically very difficult. To increase taxes is not always politically easy for a government, and it can lead to huge protests and U-turns where they change their mind because of all the political problems that arise. And government cuts in the public sector even more tricky, and it can indeed be harmful to the public sector. So if you cut the NHS, you cut health spending, it can lead to longer waiting lists and real harm to people. If you cut education or training budgets, of course, it can have a negative supply side effect on the economy. So you might cut benefits, but then that might increase relative poverty. So these are difficult decisions and hard to achieve. Crowding out is another potential problem. If the government becomes too large, it can push out the private sector. Watch the amazing video on crowding out to check that out. Joking. And as I just said, it could have harmful supply side effects. I'll just develop that a little more. Imagine that you are a firm and you pay corporation tax, and one year it's 20%, you think, that's okay. And then next year it's 30%, you think, oh my goodness, how are we going to pay that? Next year it's 10%. In other words, if tax rates continually go up and down, they lead to uncertainty, and that has a negative supply side effect. So tax rates really shouldn't be meddled with too much, otherwise you can have a harmful supply side effect. So these are the main problems with using discretionary fiscal policy, so much so that governments in recent years have tended to focus more on monetary policy for demand management. If we just look at some basic terms on fiscal policy, what we mean by the fiscal stance is, if it's neutral, it's a fiscal policy aims to have no impact on aggregate demand. If it's reflationary, which we mean expansionary, then it aims to increase aggregate demand in the future, generally by reducing taxation and or increasing government expenditure. And of course the opposite is deflationary fiscal policy. This aims to reduce aggregate demand in the future. Another word for deflation could be a contractionary fiscal policy, doing the opposite to the above. And a word that's been used recently a great deal, and at certain periods in history, such as the 1930s, such as the 1980s, is the word fiscal austerity, loved by the media and historians. Well, basically this means a deflationary fiscal policy, maybe over a period of years. And the reason for this is to reduce the structural deficit, certainly to reduce the budget deficit. And to reduce the budget deficit, you might want to reduce government borrowing, and usually this counters the automatic stabilisation effect that's occurring. So if you've got a weak economy, in a recession, you've got a budget deficit, it's big, the structural deficit, you think, gosh, you've got to deal with this. So generally you introduce cuts in government expenditure and or increase tax revenues. Okay? If you do that, it should reduce the budget deficit. But if you've got a weak economy, it could be counterproductive if you think about it, because if you pursue this deflationary policy too much, it could actually reduce economic growth. You could have negative economic growth with falling GDP. Then what's going to happen to tax revenue? Well, tax revenue is going to fall. So there's a danger that fiscal austerity doesn't always work. Okay, so I hope that's useful. Thank you for watching.